The text for the message today comes from the Old Testament book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is right after the book of Isaiah. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah. If you get to Lamentations, you've gone too far. Go back one. Jeremiah. We're going to read chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, and the title of the message today is The Call to the Ministry. Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth, the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the exile of Jerusalem in the 5th month. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Alas, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, because I am a youth. But the Lord said to me, Do not say I am a youth, because everywhere I send you, you shall go. And all that I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord stretched out his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. This month, July, marks the 41st anniversary of my being licensed to preach. Next Sunday, the first Sunday of August, marks the 36th anniversary of the beginning of my ministry as a pastor. I was called to be the pastor of Harmony Baptist Church in Picayune, Mississippi, when I had just completed my first year of seminary. And next Sunday also marks the beginning of my 13th year here as pastor of this church, First Baptist Church of Baldwin Park. I came a month before 9/11 in 2001. So I have 3 anniversaries in regard to my ministry in the span of 1 week. So if you'll permit me today, I'm going to speak much more personally than I normally would. The call to the ministry. What is a call? When I made my call to the ministry public at the age of 18, I would have people ask me, well, why are you becoming a minister? Is it because you see a need for it? Well, I've had a lot of bad haircuts in my day, but I never wanted to be a barber. Seeing a need for the ministry is not a good reason for choosing to be a minister. Or I have people ask me, why are you becoming a minister? Do you come from a family of ministers? No, I don't. And the answer I would always give is I'm becoming a minister because that's what God called me to do. Now, a call is a mysterious thing. Somebody asked Adrian Rogers, who was a famous preacher of another day at Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis. Someone asked him, when God called you to the ministry, did you hear an audible voice? And he answered, no, it was a whole lot louder than that. And I sort of know what he's talking about because it was that way with me. It was not an audible voice, but it was real, it was persistent, and it was unchanging and unshakable. And when I was saved as a 16-year-old boy, almost immediately the Lord began to deal with me about this, about the call to the ministry. And 2 years later, at the age of 18, when I was sure I made that decision public and was licensed to preach by my home church, Delman Road Baptist Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. And then 5 years later, when I began my pastoral ministry, was ordained by the same church. In fact, I have here today the Bible that I was given that year, 1978, when I was ordained by the Delman Road Baptist Church. I have the signatures in here of all of the people who are on my ordination council. Many of them have gone on to be with the Lord. I used to preach from this Bible every Sunday. I did that for 15 or 20 years. I finally stopped because I wanted it to last for my entire ministry. So this is the first time I've preached from this Bible in about 20 years, but I thought I'd bring it today for this. My ordination by that church was a blessed event, but for a preacher, the ordination of God, what we call the call of God, is the most important call that matters. I remember reading of the great George Truett. He was called the Prince of Preachers. He was the pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas for almost 50 years. He was there before W.A. Criswell went. When, George Truett, as a young man, he had no intention of going into the ministry. He was working on a farm in Sherman, Texas. He was the Sunday school superintendent of his hometown church, but he had plans to go into another career. But his hometown church ordained him against his will because they saw the call of God in him. He didn't consent, but God had called and he answered. G. Campbell Morgan of England, on the other hand, always wanted to be a preacher. When he was a little boy, he would perform funerals for the pets of his friends when the pets died. And at the age of 23, when he preached a trial sermon before the examining board of the Methodist Church there in London, they turned him down flat and suggested to him that he do something else. He wrote a one-word telegram to his father: rejected. His father wrote back a telegram that said, rejected on earth, but accepted in heaven. G. Campbell Morgan would later be ordained by the Congregationalist Church. And no preacher in the English language today has more sermons published than G. Campbell Morgan. Now here in chapter 1 of the text we read this morning, we read about Jeremiah's call. That name Jeremiah, by the way, it means God throws or God hurls. And it speaks to the reality of Jeremiah's call, that he did not seek it. He was conscripted by God, drafted into the ministry to be thrown into situations to speak God's message to people who more often than not didn't want to hear it. Jeremiah didn't choose the ministry, it chose him, or God chose him. And he was an unlikely choice for a preacher. Not what you think of when you think of a preacher. His own family threatened to kill him after he preached his first sermon. He was a lonely man, quite often depressed, misunderstood, and rejected. Not a perfect man by any means. It's fair to say of Jeremiah that he needed the words he spoke just as much as the people to whom he spoke them. And I have that in common with Jeremiah. In 41 years of preaching, I have often felt like a chef who needed to stop for a moment and eat the food that I was preparing for others to eat. A lot of people assume that those whom God calls into the ministry walk on water, that we're somehow above all of the problems and struggles that you face. But let me tell you, that is never the case. I've met a few preachers in my day who thought they were perfect. I've never met one who actually was. You know, I was thinking about this recently. Jesus had an inner circle. Do you remember that? Peter, James, and John? They got to go into the room with him when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter. They got to go up on the mountaintop, on the Mount of Transfiguration, and see Jesus transformed in his glory. They got to go into the garden with him when he prayed. And if Jesus had an inner circle, that means he had an outer circle, the other 9. We've often assumed that Peter, James, and John were on the inner circle because they were somehow better than the others, but they were not. They possibly had more aptitude, more potential. But if you'll recall, when Jesus was arrested, Peter cursed and denied that he even knew Jesus. James and John tried to cut a backroom deal with Jesus to get the corner office and the keys to the executive washroom when Jesus came into his kingdom. Thomas never did anything like that or said anything like that. When Jesus was arrested, Thomas said, "Let's go to Jerusalem and die with him." Andrew and Philip, they just kept bringing people to Jesus. Maybe James and Peter and John were the inner circle because Jesus needed to keep an eye on them. I don't know why God calls those whom he calls, but I do know that what the Apostle Paul said of himself applies to every one of us, and that is that we have this treasure in earthen vessels. And by that he meant fragile jars of clay. God said to Jeremiah in verse 5 of our text, "Before you were born, I knew you." And that word "knew" means literally chose. He was saying to Jeremiah, before you were born, I chose you. There was no earlier claim on Jeremiah's life than God's claim. I preached my first sermon at the age of 16 at the Dalman Road Baptist Church. It was in what used to be called the Sunday School General Assembly. That's the little 15-minute meeting before Sunday school began. I was not the first choice. It was a youth week at our church, and the boy they had asked to preach the little short sermon there, he backed out. He got cold feet. And in desperation, they asked me. I look back on that now and I realize the hand of God was at work. I didn't see that then. But after I preached that little sermon, which was about 10% Bible, 90% chick tract that I had found on the second coming, after I preached it, the pastor of the church, who is now my father-in-law, asked me if I would preach that same sermon the following Sunday night to the entire church. Now, let me tell you, he didn't ask me to do that because that sermon was so good. Mercifully, I don't have the notes from that sermon anymore. I'm sure it was horrible. But as I think back on it and wonder, now why did he do that? I think I know the reason now as a pastor. I think he did it because he saw some evidence of the call of God on my life. Not that I was a polished, finished product, but he could see that God was called. That was at the age of 16. 2 years later, at 18, I made that calling public. And in the 41 years since then, I have never once doubted my calling. Now, I've had doubts along the way in 41 years, don't get me wrong. But I have never doubted my calling. For 41 years, that calling has been an anchor in my life. It's so far back now that I can't see the anchor anymore, but I can still pull on the chain. It's in the past, a 41-year call. But on the other hand, it's also a present call. In the book of Numbers, we read about Israel in the wilderness, that they were led by a pillar of fire. You remember that. It was a cloud at night, during the day, and fire at night. When it moved, they moved. And when it stopped, they stopped. When it moved, there were priests who got up and they blew silver trumpets. And when they blew them, even at midnight, Israel got up and moved. It's not enough to just pull on a chain from the past. We also have to hear God today. Now, anyone with any sense would say what Jeremiah said in verse 6 when he said to God, I can't speak for you. In Jeremiah's case, it's because he thought he was too young. He was probably my age when I began to hear God's call, 16. That's probably about exactly where Jeremiah was. And he said to God, I can't do it. Amos, Moses, Isaiah, they all said similar things to God. And God brushed aside Jeremiah's words just as he did with them when he said to them, "You will go where I send you, and you will speak the words that I tell you." And that sets the agenda for any preacher. You will go where I send you and speak what I tell you. In verses 8 and 9 of our text, God puts his hand on Jeremiah's mouth and said, "I will put my words in your mouth." And after 41 years of preaching, I still don't understand that process, but I know it happens. The great Swiss theologian Karl Barth said there is a threefold form of the Word of God. There is the living Word, Jesus. There is the written Word, Scripture. And there is the preached Word. The great Reformed Church confession is that preaching is the Word of God for the people of God. And that has always been my goal in preaching, to take the then of the Scriptures and apply it to the now of life. To turn was into is, then into now, there into here. God tells Jeremiah in verse 9, "I have put my words in your mouth." I've always been very careful as a preacher not to flip that around and put my words in God's mouth. I've been here long enough for you to know that what I'm telling you is true. I will almost never in a sermon give you my personal opinions on anything. You have never heard me speak politics from the pulpit. I'm not up here to give you my opinions, and on the very rare occasions when I do give you an opinion in a sermon, I'll tell you that's what I'm doing. I'm not up here to tell you which political party is better. I'm here to deliver a word from God and to show you how to apply it to your life, and that's it. The Greeks had a harp. They called it the Aeolian harp. It was named after the Greek god Aeolus, who was the god of the wind. It's the only instrument in the world, by the way, that is not played by humans. It's played by the wind. It has a hole. It's shaped like a box, and a hole can come into, the wind can come into the hole. And they would put it up on the mountainsides when it was windy out. And the wind would blow through and blow on the strings that are inside the box, and it would play music. That's how God works in the proclamation of his word. God gives the wind, but he has to have someone who will stand up on the mountainside and hold the box up. No human can make the wind blow, but every now and then God puts his hand on someone like Jeremiah and says, "If you'll stand up on the mountainside and hold the box up high, I'll send the wind." Philip Brooks, the great rector of Trinity Church in Boston, said that preaching is God's truth through human personality. It is not truth without personality, and it is not personality without truth. And that's a great point. By God's design, no two preachers are alike. You see this even in the Bible. You read John's Gospel and you read Mark's Gospel, and they're as different as they could be. They talk about the same events, but in such different ways. John's Gospel is deep, philosophical. There is some mystical almost thought in it as he talks about Jesus, the incarnate Word, who dwelled in the beginning with the Father. John's Gospel, on the other hand, portrays Jesus as always on the go, always busy, always leaving immediately to go from one place to another. Or you turn to Paul's writings, this great logical mind that gives us the ordered doctrinal treatise of the book of Romans, truth through human personality. In verse 7, God gives Jeremiah the two requirements of a call. You will go where I send you, and speak what I tell you. God had two requirements for Jeremiah and for any preacher: to be willing to go where God sends, to be willing to say what God tells him to say. God says to Jeremiah, you speak the word I give you, and I'll worry about the venue. The first sermons I preached after those two I just mentioned to you, the first sermons I preached were at the Plantation Nursing Home in New Orleans. Our church had a ministry there on Sunday mornings. I must have been 16, 17 years old. in that room there with those people in the nursing home, half of them asleep, I'm sure. There I was, 17 years old, with my Bible telling them, oh, how tough life was. But I preached, and they listened. Then I started preaching on Friday nights at a worship service our church had for the Charity Hospital, patients of the Charity Hospital there in New Orleans. I was about 18 or so at the time. In college, I would preach on weekends, filling in for vacationing pastors or preaching youth revivals. I preached in little country churches in Mississippi in places like Moselle and Bassfield and Mount Olive and New Hebron and Sumrall, Purvis, Tylertown, Taylorsville, and others. And some of those places were so little, they didn't even have a town. But I went and I preached, and the people listened. And from that day until now, I've learned to leave the venues in God's hands. I was talking to a pastor friend once, and I said to him, I've learned not to kick in any doors that God doesn't open. And he said, well, I don't kick the doors in, but I will put WD-40 on the hinges. And I said, let me tell you, I've learned not even to do that. We don't need to. God will provide the venue. He said that. That's part of His promise. And Jeremiah is a perfect example. 2,600 years ago, God told this teenage boy, Jeremiah, I will put you before nations and kings. Now, Jeremiah came from a little village of the smallest tribe of a nation, Judah, that was about to pass from the face of the earth. I can just imagine him going home and saying, guess what God told me? When God spoke those words to Jeremiah 2,600 years ago, the Acropolis and the Parthenon in Greece, they weren't even in the blueprints yet. Rome was still just a city 500 years away from being an empire. Today, the Acropolis and the Parthenon are in ruins, and the Roman Empire is long gone. But around the world today, millions of believers have picked up their Bibles and read the words that God spoke to a teenage boy named Jeremiah 2,600 years ago. And here we are in a place that Jeremiah could never have imagined, reading the words that God spoke to him and through him. I'm 59 now. I suppose that places me in the autumn of my ministry, closer to the end than to the beginning. The things that seem so important to me as a young preacher, the big churches, the large crowds, the special recognition, they don't seem so important now. Mostly just make me tired when I think about them. When I look back over the course of my ministry, what I remember now are the people. And in 41 years of ministry, if I've learned anything, it's not how many or how much or how popular or how famous. It's how faithful we are to go in where God sends us and speaking the words that God gives us to say. And you know, that's the same for you. That's what God requires of you. To be faithful doing what God gives you to do in the places where God sends you to do. Haddon Robinson once wrote a story where he imagined himself standing before God on Judgment Day, wondering what God might say to him, looking back over his ministry, his time on earth, and what God thought was important compared to what he thought was important. And I tried to do that for myself this week, getting ready for this message. I wonder how it works when you get there. I wonder if they go in alphabetical order. If they do, I'd be kind of close to the front. B, Bowers. Maybe there's a voice from a cloud that says, yes, Bowers, I remember you. Tell me what you remember about your ministry. I try to think of all the things that made me sound important. I'd say, I remember as a 19-year-old boy preaching before 1,500 people at a citywide youth rally in New Orleans, Louisiana. God would say, no, I wasn't thinking of that. I'd say, I remember coming to California as a pastor of First Baptist Church First Baptist Bilingual Church in Pico Rivera, the largest bilingual church in California. A writer from the state newspaper came down from Fresno and wrote a big article about our church. I was so proud of that. I would say, no, I wasn't thinking of that. I'd say, well, I remember turning in my dissertation from my PhD. I worked 42 hours a week, 3 hours every morning, 3 hours every night after Mary and the kids went to bed. 6 hours a day, 7 days a week for a solid year, researching and writing over 2,200 hours of blood, sweat, and tears. I was so proud of that when I turned it in. And the Lord would say, I didn't read it. I wasn't thinking of that. I'd say, well, I remember going to work for the California Southern Baptist Convention and traveling all over the state and all over the country for conferences and meetings. I remember being in one just across the river from New York City, a conference on the church and the law. One of the lawyers from the White House was there to lead the conference that day. The Lord was saying, no, I was in New York City that day, but I wasn't at the conference. I was too busy helping the poor and the homeless. I forgot. I'd say, well, I remember 3 years in a row being the keynote speaker at the conference of Hispanic pastors of California, speaking to hundreds of Hispanic Baptist pastors, and they told me it was the only time in their history they'd ever asked the same speaker to come back 3 years in a row. And the Lord would say, no, I wasn't thinking of that either. And I'd say, well, then what, Lord? What? And he'd say, do you remember the summer, 1983? You were 28 years old. And there was a couple, they were members of your church. And I'd say, I do remember that. I was pastor of a little Baptist church out in the country in South Louisiana. And he'd say, that couple, they rushed the young wife, 32 years old, rushed her to the hospital. She died from a brain hemorrhage, unexpected. I say, I remember that. And he said, the next day, you were there all day with him in the hospital, and the next day you drove out to the house. They had a little 12-year-old girl. And you drove out to the house to visit the dad and the girl. And that little 12-year-old girl, she was sitting out in the front yard. I would say, I remember that, Lord. It was summer. So hot that day. It must have been 100 degrees. And the Lord would say, when you got there, she was crying. And you went over and you sat down next to her. I remember that. We sat down under a tree to be in the shade. And she cried and told you about how sad she was, how afraid she was now with no mother, how she felt like she had no hope. You told that little girl about Jesus. And that next Sunday, she walked down the aisle in your church. And that night, you baptized her. And the Lord would say to me, that's what I remember. This morning we're going to sing as our song of invitation, hymn number 294, Have Thine Own Way. Let's stand.